Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating and honestly, deeply complex topic, the architecture of military and law enforcement discipline. We're going to explore the core tension that sits at the very heart of these organizations. It's this incredibly delicate, sometimes precarious balance between strict, unquestioning obedience on one hand and the need for individual, on-the-ground discretion on the other. It's a dynamic that literally shapes how armies fight and how our communities are policed. And the mechanics behind it are just absolutely incredible.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to break this massive topic down into 4 distinct parts: the foundation of discipline, the anatomy of command, the military-police divide, and finally, modern challenges and evolution.
Section 1, the foundation of discipline. To really grasp why these incredibly rigid structures exist today, we actually have to look back at history. Take this powerful quote from George Washington during the Revolutionary War. It perfectly anchors our understanding. At the time, the American forces were, well, they were essentially a chaotic militia, facing off against a highly advanced British Empire. Washington realized that discipline was the single critical difference between a disorganized mob and a truly formidable army. Without it, survival on the battlefield was simply impossible. So, to fix that lack of discipline, Washington brought in Prussian officer Baron von Steuben. In 1789, he formalized this entire concept by writing what became known as the Blue Book. He trained soldiers in manual of arms and drill commands, basically creating a baseline of standardized movements and responses. And astonishingly, that exact foundation of standards and uniformity, it's still the bedrock of modern drill and ceremony today. It spread like wildfire. So the crucial point here is defining what we actually mean by discipline in these high-stakes environments. It's not just about standing at attention. Mechanically speaking, it's the structured system of hierarchical organization, clear command authority, mandatory rule adherence, and standardized procedures that govern defense and safety forces. Really, it's an entire operational ecosystem. In fact, that discipline relies on 6 integrated pillars holding the whole shebang up. You start with a rigid hierarchical structure and clear command authority. You enforce that with strict rules, back it up with intense accountability systems, and cement it all through constant, rigorous training. What you should take away from this is that discipline isn't just about leaders yelling orders. It's a massive, integrated system designed to guarantee absolute operational readiness. Section 2, Anatomy of Command. Now that we have the historical foundation, let's explore how this theory translates into the actual structural architecture of modern forces. It is absolutely fascinating how closely military and law enforcement hierarchies mirror each other. From a general down to a private, or a police chief down to a patrol officer, these vertical chains of command are designed for one primary purpose: to ensure the rapid, unquestioned execution of authorized commands. Because when a crisis hits, this structure prevents confusion and completely eliminates the time-consuming need for debate. But that authority has strict limits, governed by things like the use of force continuum. Imagine a routine traffic stop escalating. Discipline dictates an officer has to move step by step, from mere physical presence to verbal commands, all the way up to lethal force only as an absolute last resort. These protocols exist precisely to protect everyone involved, ensuring that any force used is strictly proportional to the threat. And what happens when those strict rules are broken? Well, that's where highly structured accountability systems step in. Taking the South African National Defense Force, or SANDF, as a prime example, we see how military systems enforce these rules through escalating accountability measures. It starts with administrative actions. Think warnings or extra duties, then escalates to non-judicial punishments like rank reduction, and peaks at a full-blown court-martial for the most serious offenses. To keep this massive hierarchy actually functioning, organizations rely on a fascinating micro-level rule known as the span of control. It's actually wild to think about, but even massive global armies break down to the basic principle that one supervisor can only effectively command a limited number of subordinates, typically between 3 to 7 people. This ensures that the command architecture remains tight and responsive without completely overloading leadership when a high-stress crisis breaks out. And this brilliantly illustrates why all of this matters on the ground. Realistic, high-stress training, like U.S. Army soldiers conducting room-to-room clearing in urban operations, is exactly what implants these hierarchical standards so deeply that they hold up under the intense psychological and physical stress of actual combat. Discipline literally has to become muscle memory. Section 3. The military-police divide. This brings us to a critical narrative climax in our explainer, the inherent tension that arises when military architecture crosses over into civilian policing. So there's a deep philosophical friction between these two worlds. Military discipline is inherently rigid. It's command-driven and relies on absolute obedience, often limiting the civil rights of the personnel involved. Modern policing, however, is built on discretion. It relies on an individual officer reading a situation on the ground, making split-second situational decisions, and engaging in community-oriented dialogue. We can see this exact tension play out in real life through the Dutch Royal Netherlands Marechaussee. They're a military police force that acts as a strategic reserve during large-scale domestic protests. Because these officers have military status, they lack certain civil rights, like the right to strike or refuse orders. The whole debate centers on what happens when a top-down, military-style order to disperse a crowd overrules an officer on the ground who's actively trying to engage in de-escalation dialogue. It's a fundamental clash between the need for fast crisis response and the very real risk of excessive force.
But it's absolutely vital to understand that even within the strictest military frameworks, absolute obedience has absolute legal limits. The obedience rule dictates that personnel have a strict duty to obey lawful orders, but, and this is a big but, they have an equally binding duty to refuse unlawful orders, meaning any command that violates constitutional rights, international law, or basic human rights. You cannot just blindly follow an illegal command.
Section 4. Modern challenges and evolution. As the world changes, so must these organizations. Let's analyze how these historical structures are being forced to adapt to 21st century realities. We're basically witnessing a massive organizational shift right now. The old traditional approach relied heavily on a rigid command and control model, absolute obedience, paramilitary distance from the community, and frankly, often fear-based motivation. Today, the evolution is moving towards transparent, collaborative servant leadership. This is where legitimate authority is earned through competence, and there is a heavy emphasis on community partnership and ethical reasoning. And this evolution is being driven by unprecedented contemporary pressures. Today's forces are really struggling to balance the rigid discipline needed for survival with the situational autonomy required by the public. Plus, they're confronting the harsh reality of high PTSD rates, which means mental health support is no longer optional. It's a critical operational necessity. Throw in the rapid integration of technologies like body cameras, the intense public demand for advanced de-escalation, and severe recruiting shortages, and you have massive institutions trying to adapt in real time. Yet despite all of these changes, the core mission remains intensely demanding. Professional military education still has to continually instill a level of discipline that prepares soldiers for the harsh, unforgiving realities of large-scale combat operations. I mean, maintaining readiness in a literal fighting position requires a kind of discipline that just transcends generations. Which leaves us with this final, really profound question. As our security forces continue to rapidly evolve, how do we perfectly balance the rigid, unyielding discipline required for rapid crisis response and combat survival with the compassionate situational discretion that is so absolutely necessary for democratic civilian oversight? It is a delicate, ongoing tightrope walk, and understanding its architecture is really the very first step in ensuring these institutions serve us effectively and ethically. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating dynamic.